Imagine the capital of Nuuk, not as a colorful coastal town, but as a jagged fortress of concrete and steel. Above, the aurora borealis dances in neon greens and purples, but its light no longer guides hunters. It reflects off the blackened barrels of anti-aircraft guns and the reinforced glass of coastal watchtowers. In our reality, Greenland is the ultimate strategic prize, a massive, ice-covered expanse often dismissed by military planners as undefended. We see it as a quiet, autonomous territory, a place of sled dogs, glaciers, and peaceful scientific research. But in this timeline, that silence is shattered. A failed attempt at annexation doesn't just spark a diplomatic row. It ignites the most brutal, unconventional war in modern history. This is the story of how the world's largest island was transformed from a peaceful Arctic frontier into a permanent, frozen graveyard for superpowers, where the ice didn't just hide resources, it hid a resistance that would bring the mightiest empires to their knees. We are stepping into a dark reality where the high north became the center of a global flashpoint, proving that some territories are never truly undefended when the land itself decides to fight back. This is the what if of the Arctic War. To understand the scale of the catastrophe, we must first look at the Greenland of our reality, a silent titan of the North. In the corridors of the Pentagon and the Kremlin, Greenland isn't just a land of glaciers, it's an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It sits at the heart of the GIUK Gap, the Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom corridor, a narrow geographical throat through which any naval fleet must pass to dominate the North Atlantic. For decades, the crown jewel of this frozen expanse has been Pitufik, formerly Thule Air Base, where massive radar arrays scan the horizon for the first sign of nuclear Armageddon. But Greenland's value isn't just in its position, it's in its soil. Beneath the retreating ice sheets lies one of the world's largest untapped reserves of rare earth minerals, the lifeblood of every smartphone, electric vehicle battery, and advanced missile guidance system on Earth. Historically, this immense strategic weight was balanced by a fragile diplomatic mantra, high north, low tension. It was a gentleman's agreement among Arctic nations that the region would remain a zone of cooperation, a place where science and survival trumped sovereignty. However, in this timeline, the year 2029 brings the resource scarcity crisis. As global stockpiles of essential minerals plummeted and the transition to green energy reached a fever pitch, the world's eyes turned toward the melting fjords with predatory intent. The high north was no longer a place of low tension. It was a gold mine waiting for a claim to be staked. The peace of the Arctic, once thought to be as permanent as the permafrost, was suddenly revealed to be as thin as spring ice. The stage was set, the players were desperate, and the era of cooperation was about to be buried under the weight of global ambition. The silence of northeast Greenland wasn't broken by a declaration of war, but by the low, guttural thrum of heavy engines echoing off the fjords. The Pact, a surging Eastern superpower alliance, had grown tired of diplomatic delays. Under the guise of a peacekeeping landing, their fleet moved into the isolated Northeast, claiming they were merely securing vital mining infrastructure against regional instability. Their military intelligence was dismissive. bordering on arrogant. To the Pact's high command, Greenland's only defense was the Serious Dog Sled Patrol, a legendary but tiny unit of Danish elite soldiers who spent more time navigating glaciers than engaging in combat. The assumption in the Pact's war room was simple. When the warships appeared through the mist, the sleds would stop, the hands would go up, and the world's largest island would change hands without a single shot being fired. They expected a logistical exercise, not a war, but they had failed to see the shadow moving behind the diplomatic curtain. Realizing that a paralyzed NATO might not act in time, a rogue coalition of Nordic states had already crossed their own Rubicon. They had activated the Northern Shield Protocol, a secret, prearranged defense agreement designed for this exact nightmare. As the first Pact landing craft lowered its ramp onto the jagged frozen shore, a coded burst of data flashed across the Arctic Circle. The undefended prize was a mirage. The protocol was live, and for the invaders, the quietest place on Earth was about to become the loudest. Military planners in the Pact's war rooms had spent months staring at maps of Greenland, seeing only a soft target. To them, the island was a strategic void, a landmass twice the size of Western Europe, with no standing army, no surface-to-air missile batteries, and only a handful of police officers. They viewed the vast frozen distances not as a barrier, but as a guarantee that any resistance would be too scattered to matter. It was a textbook no defense myth, born from the arrogance of superpowers who measure strength only in hull counts and battalion numbers. But as the first wave of Pact transport planes roared over the jagged coastline, the ice labyrinth snapped shut. The Serious Dog Sled Patrol, alongside local hunters who knew every shifting crevasse of the inland ice, didn't meet the invaders on a traditional battlefield. They vanished into the white. Under the Northern Shield Protocol, the Arctic didn't just become a combat zone, it became sentient. The Pact's heavy transports, laden with elite paratroopers, relied on a network of automated navigation beacons and GPS signals to navigate the featureless white expanse. They didn't expect those signals to lie. The first 3 transports didn't fall to missiles. They fell to the terrain itself. Localized electronic warfare units, pre-positioned in hidden caches years ago, flooded the frequencies with phantom data. Navigation beacons, captured and recalibrated by the resistance, led the lead aircraft miles off course, straight into the side of a fog-shrouded mountain range. In the cockpits of the trailing planes, pilots watched their instruments spin wildly as the ground-mapping radar hallucinated peaks where there were valleys. Before the first Pact soldier could even hook their parachute to the static line, the undefended island had claimed its first 100 lives. The message was clear. Greenland wouldn't be conquered by a flag-planting ceremony. It would have to be bled for, one frozen inch at a time. The Pact's response to the initial disaster was not a retreat, but a scream of iron and nylon. Realizing their soft landing had been compromised, the High Command doubled down, darkening the skies over Nuuk and Ilulissat with thousands of paratroopers. Elite divisions, supposedly hardened for Arctic conditions, plummeted through the freezing mist, intending to seize the administrative hubs and force a quick surrender. But as their boots hit the permafrost, the reality of the high north began to shred the invaders' doctrine. This was not the urban combat of Berlin or Grozny. This was sub-zero carnage. At -40 degrees, the very laws of physics turned traitor. Standard issue lubricants turned to glue in the chambers of assault rifles, rendering them useless clubs. High tensile steel became as brittle as glass, snapping under the mere stress of recoil. Radios failed as batteries that promised hours of life died in minutes, leaving entire platoons isolated and blind in the suffocating polar night. The packed soldiers, huddled in the doorways of Nuuk, found that the cold was a more efficient killer than any bullet. And then the shadows moved. The world expected a refugee crisis. Instead, it witnessed a revolution. Greenlandic civilians didn't flee into the interior, they became the interior. Organizing into the tundra partisans, local hunters and fishers used their generational mastery of the environment to turn the world's largest island into a decentralized nightmare. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were ghosts in white furs who knew which ice was thin and which ridge offered a perfect kill zone. Supply lines, already strained by the impossible geography, were systematically dismantled by partisans on silent dog sleds and modified snowmobiles. A single well-placed shot from a hunting rifle would disable a fuel bladder, and within hours, an entire packed mechanized column would become a collection of frozen iron coffins. What was supposed to be a lightning annexation had devolved into a full-scale national resistance. Every colorful house in the capital was now a fortress, and every snowdrift was a potential grave. The pact had come for the minerals, but they were finding only a frozen, unyielding hell. As the tundra partisans bled the pact on the ground, the rest of the world watched the satellite feeds in a state of paralyzed shock. In the grand halls of Brussels, the NATO machine, designed for decades to counter a conventional sweep across the North German plain, found itself choked by its own bureaucracy. The pact had played their hand with cynical brilliance, framing the invasion as a stabilization mission to protect vital economic interests. For a week that felt like a century, diplomats argued over the legal definitions of Article 5, while the Danish government's pleas for help were met with deep concern, but no boots on the ground. But for the nations of the High North, the luxury of debate did not exist. For London, Oslo, and Ottawa, Greenland wasn't a distant island. It was the strategic heart of their own survival. Shaking off the paralysis of the alliance, a coalition of the willing shattered the diplomatic standstill. Without a formal NATO mandate, the United Kingdom, Norway, and Canada mobilized. They knew that if the pact solidified its grip on Greenland, the North Atlantic would effectively become an enemy lake, and the security of the Western Hemisphere would vanish overnight. The Atlantic, once the world's busiest maritime highway, transformed into a lethal no-go zone. This was no longer a war of grand maneuvers, but a silent, claustrophobic struggle beneath the waves. Attack submarines from both sides slipped into the freezing depths, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse beneath the shifting ice floes. In the blackness of the GIU gap, the only reality was the frantic ping of active sonar and the cold mathematical certainty of a torpedo solution. One acoustic mistake meant a watery grave for hundreds of sailors, as the depths claimed billion-dollar vessels that the world would never see again. The tension reached a breaking point as the ultimate symbol of Western naval reach entered the theater, a British carrier strike group led by the HMS Queen Elizabeth, cut through the berg-filled waters of the Davis Strait, its decks crowded with F-35s, ready to provide the air cover the Greenlandic resistance so desperately needed. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. As the steel giants loomed through the freezing mist off the coast of Nuuk, the world held its breath. The Arctic air no longer just felt cold. It felt electric with the threat of total annihilation. The frozen trench was no longer confined to the land. It had swallowed the sea, and the first shot fired in these waters would signal the end of the old world order. While the seas churned with the threat of a naval apocalypse, the true nightmare was unfolding on the roof of the world. In a desperate bid to bypass the coastal bottlenecks, the pack launched a daring mechanized offensive across the inland ice sheet, a 2-mile-thick desert of ancient frost. It was a sight never before seen in human history. Columns of white camouflaged armor and heavy transport crawlers grinding across a featureless horizon of ice, attempting to flank the southern defenses from the uninhabitable interior. But the Arctic does not care for military doctrine. In the real world, military engineers know that at minus 40 degrees, physics becomes the ultimate enemy. Engine oil thickens into the consistency of molasses. Rubber seals and gaskets shatter like glass, and the very steel of a main battle tank becomes as brittle as porcelain under the stress of combat. As the Pact's invincible Arctic divisions pushed deeper into the white void, their high-tech machinery began to eat itself. The easy win, promised by the generals in the east, evaporated as the environment itself joined the resistance. Sensing the vulnerability of the stalled columns, the tundra partisans struck with surgical precision. They didn't engage the tanks head-on. They targeted the lifeblood of the machine, the fuel lines, and the heater units, using modified snowmobiles and an intimate knowledge of hidden crevasses. The resistance cut the supply arteries of a superpower. Then the sky turned white. A catastrophic Pitarak, a gravity-driven windstorm macaque to Greenland, descended with the force of a hurricane. Visibility dropped to zero. In the blinding chaos, the Pact's advanced sensors were rendered useless by the static of the storm. Their soldiers, trapped in metal coffins that were rapidly becoming deep freezers, could only listen to the howling wind and the occasional haunting crack of a partisan's rifle. The offensive didn't just stall. It became a frozen quagmire, a graveyard of ambition where the ice itself acted as the executioner. The momentum of the invasion was broken, but as the Pact realized their conventional might was failing against the cold, their tactics shifted from conquest to a much darker form of desperation. Frustrated by the frozen graveyard of the inland ice sheet, the Pact High Command abandoned the pretense of a liberation. If they could not outmaneuver the terrain, they would break the people who called it home. This was the birth of the whiteout policy, a systematic, brutal campaign of infrastructure erasure designed to weaponize the Arctic winter itself. They didn't need to fire on the crowds, they only needed to extinguish the lights. In Nuuk, the capital, the impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. Precision strikes from long-range cruise missiles dismantled the city's hydroelectric plants and backup diesel generators. Within hours, the life-sustaining warmth of modern insulation vanished. As the mercury plummeted toward minus 30, the city's plumbing froze and burst, cutting off water. In the pitch-black hallways of apartment complexes, families huddled together under piles of caribou skins and synthetic sleeping bags, listening to the terrifying silence of a city dying in the dark. It wasn't a siege in the traditional sense. It was a race against hypothermia. The Pact's ultimatum was simple: surrender the resistance leaders and accept administrative oversight, or watch the entire population freeze to death by morning. Yet, amidst the frost-shattered ruins of the communications network, a single signal flickered to life. Transmitting from a mobile clandestine setup deep within the coastal fjords, the voice of the North began its broadcast. It was a crackling, low-frequency defiance that cut through the static of the electronic warfare. "Do not sleep," the narrator's voice urged, steady and calm. "Move. Keep the blood flowing. The ice is our wall, and the darkness is our shield. We are still here." This radio broadcast became the heartbeat of a nation on the brink. It shared survival tips, coordinates for hidden supply caches, and news of the resistance's small victories. It transformed a humanitarian disaster into a spiritual furnace. The Pact had hoped the cold would make the Greenlanders submissive. Instead, it forged them into something as hard and unyielding as the permafrost itself. The tactical stalemate had evolved into an existential struggle, and as the world watched Nuke's lights go out, the stage was set for a desperate, final gamble to reclaim the North. While the people of Nuke huddled in the freezing dark, the resistance was preparing for a counterstrike that would shatter the Pact's strategic dominance. It was called Operation Frostbite. Under the cover of a multi-day polar storm that grounded the Pact's superior air power, a combined force of Danish Jaeger Corps, Norwegian FSK, and seasoned Greenlandic hunters moved across the ice on silent, electric-drive snowmobiles. Their target was the crown jewel of the high north, Thule Air Base. The Pact had treated Thule as an impregnable fortress, a hub for their sensors and logistics. They hadn't accounted for a force that didn't need a traditional supply line, using specialized thermal masking gear to blend into the minus 50-degree background. The Frostbite teams bypassed the automated perimeter and struck the command center from within. In a frantic 3-hour firefight through the hangars and radar arrays, the specialized Nordic units utilized their intimate knowledge of the base's subterranean tunnels, blueprints the Pact had never fully mapped. By dawn, the unthinkable had happened. The Pact's regional command was captured or killed, and the world's most powerful satellite tracking station was back in local hands. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a seismic geopolitical shock. For the first time in the modern era, a global superpower had been forced into a humiliating tactical retreat by a decentralized, numerically inferior force. The invincible Pact was bleeding in the snow. But as the images of the reclaimed base flashed across global screens, the victory felt hollow. Cornered and desperate to save face, the Pact High Command issued a chilling red-line communique. They claimed the loss of Thule compromised their national survival. If the base wasn't evacuated within 24 hours, they threatened asymmetric escalation, the use of tactical nuclear weapons to Edites, the northern coastline. The world held its breath. The Arctic wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was the fuse for a global nuclear exchange. At this moment, the frozen wilderness became the most dangerous place on Earth. While the world waited for the flash of a tactical nuke, a different kind of darkness began to spread: the total collapse of the global supply chain. This was the Arctic chokehold. For years, the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage had been hailed as the future of commerce, a shortcut that could shave 15 days off the journey between Shanghai and Rotterdam. But as the conflict intensified, those blue lanes turned red. Insurance premiums for Arctic transit became impossible. Then the lanes were officially closed. The Great Shortcut became a great barrier. The impact was immediate and devastating. Greenland holds some of the world's largest untapped deposits of rare earth minerals, neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium. These aren't just rocks. They are the lifeblood of the 21st century. They power everything from your smartphone and electric vehicle to the medical imaging machines in every hospital. In this timeline, the Kvanefjeld mine and other strategic sites didn't become prizes for the victor. They became scorched earth zones. The Pact, realizing they couldn't hold the mines against the frostbite insurgents, began a systematic campaign of industrial denial. If they couldn't have the minerals, no one would. The result was a global economic cardiac arrest. The price of high-end electronics tripled overnight. Factories in Germany and South Korea ground to a halt as the supply of critical components vanished into the Arctic mist. For the average person, thousands of miles away, the war in Greenland wasn't just a headline anymore. It was the reason they couldn't buy a car, fix a ventilator, or afford a basic computer. The high north had effectively strangled the global economy. The frozen island, once seen as a remote periphery, was now the epicenter of a worldwide depression. The Arctic was no longer just a battlefield, it was a cage, and the door had been slammed shut, leaving the world to freeze along with the combatants. The threat of nuclear fire didn't end the war, it simply froze it in place. By the winter of 2031, both sides realized that total victory was an impossibility in an environment that killed more soldiers than bullets ever could. The result was a geopolitical scar that the world would come to call the Ice Curtain. A line was drawn across the glaciers at the 75th parallel, effectively partitioning the world's largest island. This wasn't a diplomatic border. It was a wound. In the south, a battered but defiant coalition of Nordic states and their allies held on to the population centers of Nuuk and Ilulissat. In the north, the Pact consolidated its grip on the high Arctic, turning the rugged fjords into a network of subterranean bunkers and submarine pens. Greenland was no longer a country. It was a divided continent, a mirror of the Cold War's Berlin, but transposed onto a landscape of eternal frost and absolute silence. The demilitarized zone that now separates North and South Greenland is perhaps the most terrifying place on Earth. It is a 300-mile-wide strip of shifting ice and jagged peaks where no human dare step. Instead of soldiers, the DMZ is patrolled by ghosts in the machine. Thousands of automated AI-driven turrets are buried beneath the snow, linked to a meshed network of thermal sensors and seismic microphones. Anything that moves, a polar bear, a wandering hunter, or a desperate defector, is instantly targeted by high-velocity projectiles or autonomous loitering munitions. This is the new status quo, a permanent high-tech stalemate, where the low tension of the past has been replaced by a permanent freeze. The world has adjusted to this dark timeline, accepting that the Arctic is no longer a wilderness, but a fortified front line. Satellites show a landscape that has been fundamentally altered. The pristine white of the inland ice is now crisscrossed by the black lines of military supply roads and the glowing signatures of nuclear-powered outposts. The ice curtain is not just a barrier of steel and sensors. It is a psychological wall that has cut the world in two, turning the roof of the world into a fortress that may never be dismantled. The war didn't stop. It just became a permanent feature of the geography. But beneath the high-tech sensors and the geopolitical chess moves lies a more intimate tragedy, the slow, systematic erasure of a culture. For the Inuit people, the ice curtain isn't just a political boundary. It is a physical severance from their soul. Ancestral hunting grounds that sustained life for millennia have been transformed into area denial zones. The vast white expanses of the interior, once navigated by the stars and the wind, are now the most heavily mined regions on the planet. Millions of smart explosives lie dormant beneath the shifting snow, waiting for a vibration, a footfall, or the heat of a sled dog to trigger a lethal response. The Arctic is no longer a wilderness. It is a minefield with a view. Traditional villages like Itokortormit and Qaanaaq didn't just lose their autonomy, they lost their purpose. Thousands were forcibly relocated to resilience hubs, grim concrete apartment blocks in the south, far from the migrating herds in the sea ice. The rhythm of the seasons has been replaced by the hum of generators and the roar of cargo jets. Fortress Greenland required space, and that space was taken from the people who understood it best. Ancient trails are now blocked by chain-link fences and thermal cameras, and the traditional knowledge of the ice has become a liability in a land where every crevasse might hide a sensor or a scout. There is a bitter, haunting irony in this timeline. For decades, Greenlandic leaders sought a seat at the world's table, wanting their island to be recognized as more than a frozen footnote. In this dark reality, they got exactly what they asked for. Greenland is now the most important piece of territory on the globe, the hinge upon which the fate of superpowers turns. But that importance came at a terminal cost. The island has been hollowed out, its culture sacrificed to the gods of security and resource extraction. The world finally looked at Greenland, but when it did, it didn't see a home. It saw a platform. And in doing so, it ensured that while the island survived the war, the soul of the nation did not. Greenland became a geopolitical carcass, picked over by giants while its people watched from behind the wire. The Arctic, once the world's greatest laboratory for peace and scientific discovery, has been transformed into a frozen trench. In our reality, the North Pole is a place where rivals set aside their flags to study the planet's heartbeat. In this timeline, that heartbeat has been drowned out by the drums of war. The era of international cooperation, the high North low-tension dream, is dead. The research stations that once monitored the thinning ice have been replaced by listening posts for nuclear submarines and silos for mid-range interceptors. The most terrifying consequence of this stalemate is the scientific silence. Because the Arctic is now a restricted combat zone, global climate research has ground to a halt. The very scientists who could have warned us about the tipping points of our planet were evicted to make room for radar technicians. We are flying blind into a climate catastrophe, and the irony is as cold as the wind. The very war being fought over Greenland's resources is accelerating the destruction of the environment that holds them. As the Earth continues to warm, the retreating ice sheet doesn't reveal a new frontier for human progress. It reveals a graveyard. The melting glaciers are unearthing the macabre debris of a decade of industrial warfare. The rusted skeletons of downed transport planes, the toxic seepage from bombed-out fuel depots, and the jagged remains of mechanized divisions swallowed by the snow during the Great Blizzard. The eternal ice has become a shallow grave, slowly vomiting up the ghosts of a conflict the world tried to forget. If you were to look down from a satellite in this dark version of the 2040s, the view would be unrecognizable. The Arctic is no longer a pristine, blinding white crown at the top of the globe. Instead, it is a scarred mosaic of gray and black, plumes of soot from coal-fired military outposts stain the once pure glaciers. Massive industrial wounds, open pit mines for neodymium and terbium, pockmark the coastlines surrounded by the sprawling gray grids of military encampments. The silence of the North has been permanently shattered. In its place is the rhythmic thud of heavy machinery and the constant predatory scream of fighter jets on patrol. The Arctic is no longer the world's cooling system. It is its engine room and its front line. This is the ultimate peak of the what if, a world where we didn't just fight for the North, but we destroyed the very thing that made it worth having. The map has been redrawn in blood and oil, and the ice, once a symbol of the world's last great wilderness, is now merely a shroud over a broken, militarized wasteland. The dream of a peaceful Greenland is gone, replaced by a nightmare of steel and soot that shows no sign of thawing. But as the smoke clears from this digital simulation, we must pull back from the abyss. This scarred, soot-stained Arctic is, thankfully, not our reality. In our world, the high North remains a rare sanctuary of low tension. While the geopolitics of the 21st century are fraught with friction, the Arctic has spent decades governed not by the sword, but by the pen. The cornerstone of this piece is the Arctic Council and the landmark 2008 Ilulissat Declaration. In a rare display of foresight, the 5 coastal states, including the United States, Denmark, and even Russia, formally committed to the orderly settlement of any overlapping claims. They agreed that the law of the sea, not the law of the jungle, would dictate the future of the North. Even as tensions flare in Eastern Europe or the Pacific, the Arctic remains a place where international law still holds weight, and where diplomacy hasn't yet been buried under the permafrost. There is a profound irony in the military strategist's claim that Greenland is undefended. In our timeline, that perceived vulnerability is actually its greatest shield. Because there are no massive standing divisions to crush and no sprawling industrial complexes to seize, Greenland offers no easy win for an aggressor. It remains a land where the primary struggle isn't man against man, but humanity against the elements. The no-defense myth is in truth a blessing. It ensures that the only footprints in the deep snow belong to the serious dog sled patrol and the scientists studying the ice, rather than the boots of an occupying force. In the real world, The Arctic isn't a front line, it's a shared frontier. It is one of the few places on Earth where rivals still cooperate on search and rescue, where maritime safety is a collective goal, and where the preservation of the environment is recognized as a challenge that transcends borders. We are not living in the era of the frozen trench. We are living in an era of fragile but functional cooperation. A world where the silence of the North is a sign of peace, not a precursor to a strike. For now, the only thing Greenland is defending itself against is the wind and the cold. The peace we see today on the maps of the high North is not an accident of geography. It is a fragile, deliberate construct, a house of glass built upon the frozen ground. Our exploration of this dark timeline serves as a haunting reminder that the distance between a peaceful research station and a militarized trench is often just a single diplomatic failure or one desperate grab for resources. Geopolitics, at its core, is a choice. We can choose the ice curtain, a world of automated turrets and scorched glaciers, or we can choose the difficult, slow work of cooperation that keeps the Arctic a sanctuary for all of humanity. In our reality, Greenland remains a land of hunters, scientists, and the haunting beauty of the aurora. Not a graveyard for superpowers. This is the victory of the high North low tension policy. It is proof that even in a world of rising friction, there are still places where the environment is too harsh for hate to take root. We sleep soundly because the Arctic remains cold and quiet. Let's hope it stays that way. If this descent into a frozen war made you look at the map differently, hit the like button and subscribe to join us as we explore more of history's darkest what-ifs. What do you think is the greatest threat to Arctic peace today? Is it minerals, territory, or something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep watching the horizon.